All right, everyone, welcome back. I'm going to take this video to talk about Confucianism, very broadly speaking, focus on some of the major tenets of this particular school of Chinese philosophy, provide you with a little bit of historical context as well. Now, to kind of briefly introduce you to Chinese philosophy, if you've noticed, we're going to focus on two major schools of thought: Confucianism on the one hand and Taoism on the other hand. There are other schools of thought. In fact, this period, the Warring States period, or the spring and autumn period, is often known as the 100 schools of thought because there's all these different philosophies that developed during this time. But Confucianism and Taoism kind of represent the core of classical Chinese thought. And just as Plato is to Western philosophy, there's a philosopher of the 20th century, Albert Whitehead, who would say that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Plato kind of played a foundational role in the history and tradition of Western philosophy. That's what Confucius is going to be for Eastern philosophy. All Chinese philosophy, at least, if we're going to expand Eastern philosophy to include India, Japan, Southeast Asia, then maybe we can make some exceptions. But for Chinese philosophy specifically, Confucianism is the originator and founder of Chinese philosophy, and everything after it will in some way, shape, or form be a response to it. This is how to understand Chinese thought requires that you understand Confucianism. And we'll talk about Taoism a little bit later. So let's jump straight into it by talking about the historical context here. So the history here is super fascinating. We don't have time to really get into it, but to give you a brief synopsis, the time period that's referred to as the spring and autumn period, it's called that because of a history book called the Spring and Autumn period that was written during that time, last from roughly 771 BCE to 476 BCE. Just previous to that, in the first millennia BCE, we have the establishment of the Zhou dynasty, the Zhou Empire. And the Zhou Empire is one of the longest lasting familial dynasties in Chinese history. It lasted for almost 800 years. It was founded, the Zhou dynasty takes power of this area of China here in the first millennia BCE. And the Zhou dynasty will last, although in a smaller form, will last to about 200 BCE. So close to you can look up the exact dates, but it's close, very close to 800 years. And the time period known as the Spring and Autumn period begins in 771 with the collapse of the Zhou dynasty as a major military / political influence in China, and the dividing up of the Zhou dynasty into smaller states. So what happens, there's groups of peoples that move in from the eastern border of China. The Zhou dynasty in the first century, like I said before, encompassed most of this territory here. Long story short, they are unable to deal with these invaders. The Zhou capital has to be moved. And for the next 300 or so years, the Zhou slowly lose power over their vassal states. So this was structured kind of hierarchically. The Zhou king was the king over all of China, and beneath him, there were several different lords. If you're familiar with the European concept of feudalism, that's basically what we're talking about here with some slight modifications. But once these lords start to see that the Zhou king is having a problem and that the Zhou military has been defeated several times, they start to gain their own financial, military, economic independence from the Zhou. And it's at that point of time that we move into the spring and autumn period. And the Zhou's relationship with these former vassal states becomes hotly contentious. The states divide up, and a process and a period of infighting and civil war takes place for basically the next 500 years. For 500 years, China remains this disunited conglomeration of various states that are in constant conflict / constant political maneuvering, trying to get the constant advantage and one up each other. And it's this context that Confucius and other thinkers, but for us, Confucius, it's this context that Confucius is born into. And as a result, this political / historical environment shapes what Confucius will focus on in his philosophical inquiries. The major question at the time really revolves around and focuses on the nature and the structure of government and political power. Where does political power reside? Where does a state derive its political power from? What is the proper basis of the state? What sort of government should the people be striving to build? What is the best form of government? Kind of the classic questions of political philosophy. These are going to lie at the heart of Confucianism, as well as other traditions such as legalism. But from the get-go, we have a division that takes place in Chinese thought, the kind of the emergence of two schools between Confucius and Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu, you may have heard of. He wrote a little book called The Art of War, which is, has been a bestseller for ever since it was written, right? So you have these differing opinions here to answering these questions. Now, Sun Tzu was also interested in answering this question, how to best run and maintain a state and the origins and the basis of political power. And his answer to this question is going to come to focus largely on a nation's military might. We have a quote here from The Art of War. "Warfare is the greatest affair of the state, the basis of life and death, the way to survival or extinction. It must be thoroughly pondered and analyzed." So for Sun Tzu, the principal occupation of the state ought to be warfare. That's what the state has to focus on. That's what the state should focus on. In this position, kind of loosely speaking, we could call a form of like militarism, an emphasis on the military, an emphasis on military development, an emphasis on warfare and entering into or constantly trying to be prepared for war. Sun Tzu said, if you want political power, you got to focus on the military. Again, you got to consider the historical context here. These small states constantly infighting with each other. There's the constant threat of war that's looming. It's kind of a no-brainer for Sun Tzu. Confucius will take a different approach. And Confucius's answer, by the way, Sun Tzu's answer is kind of has this intuitive appeal to it, right? If everybody's constantly at war, saying that you should focus on warfare, yeah, that makes sense. Confucius is not very popular during his lifetime because Confucius's answer doesn't have the same sort of intuitive appeal. Confucius's answer to this question is that is kind of twofold. The leader of the state and the people of the state should focus on developing and cultivating virtue, right? If you want to be a good leader, you need to be a virtuous leader. And if you want to have a good, strong, powerful state, you need to focus on developing your people's virtue. So an emphasis on the virtue of the leader over and against military goals and aspirations. And you can see this in Confucius's answers to questions about political philosophy. So in a very famous example, Confucius was asked about whether or not a state should institute capital punishment and what that should look like, whether or not a state should kill its prisoners. And this is Confucius's response. In your governing, sir, what need is there for executions? If you desire goodness, then the common people will be good. The virtue of the gentleman is like the wind, and the virtue of the petty person is like the grass. When the wind moves over the grass is sure to bend. So this idea here is that if the leader of a nation focuses on developing his virtue, the people will do the same, and it will render questions like whether or not a state should institute capital punishment mute, because there'll be no need for it, because people are constantly trying to better themselves. Now, this dichotomy that's mentioned in this quote between the gentleman and the petty person, this has its origins back in the Chinese economic system. The gentleman, the word that Confucius uses there, of course, it's not gentleman, it's the Mandarin equivalent. Confucius, by the way, is his Latinized name. I won't attempt to pronounce his actual name because I don't speak Mandarin and I don't want to embarrass myself, right? But this word gentleman historically denoted somebody of an upper class, right? A rich, wealthy, elegant person. And the petty person, the word that's used there, usually denoted somebody of a lower economic class. Now, that's not how Confucius is using it, though. You see, for Confucius, the gentleman, the high person, the quote unquote wealthy person, was the person who was strong and wealthy in virtue. It's not a reference to material wealth, it's a reference to that person's ethical demeanor. So when he says gentleman, that's what he's referring to. The gentleman is somebody who has high moral standards and who is a good person. Okay, so let's talk about the 5 themes of Confucianism. And for this first one, I've talked before, and I think we've had this conversation before, that in philosophy, at least in Western philosophy, if you look back to ancient Greek philosophy, one of the signifiers of the birth of philosophy was kind of the separation of philosophy from religious thinking. So the Greek philosopher Thales and his prediction of the solar eclipse, he predicted the solar eclipse based off of his mathematical calculations rather than an appeal to religious causation. And thinkers like Bertrand Russell in the 20th century would say, well, that's the origins of philosophy. That's the beginning of philosophy. Whereas in Eastern philosophy, it's thought that Eastern philosophy never made that split. And so if you look at Indian philosophy is thoroughly religious, especially in the classic period. Now, it's a bit of an unfair dichotomy because you have the same thing happen in the West with the emergence of Christian philosophy, but different story for a different day. But Confucianism does not fit that mold. Confucianism is associated with some religious concepts and practices. Confucius does not deride or demean religious ideas, but he's also practicing and putting forth a philosophical system that doesn't really make reference to religion. And you see that with this first theme, happiness in the everyday world. And so let me explain what I mean by that. And hopefully it will help to explain this distinction between philosophy and religion a little bit better. So Confucianism will embrace traditional Chinese religious beliefs and practices. In religious studies, we would call this a primal religion. Primal religions are non-world religions that are found in different societies. So the major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Confucianism is actually one, but put that aside, in Hinduism. Primal religions are religions practiced typically by indigenous peoples. So if you look at like Native American religion, that's an example of a primal religion. And classic in Chinese antiquity, the primal religion centered very heavily on ancestor veneration, performing rituals to honor one's ancestors. That's a big part of most primal religions, by the way, but especially in Chinese history. Confucianism embraces a lot of those aspects. As we see, Confucianism is embraces traditional ideas and concepts, but Confucius did not focus on what we would call metaphysical claims. He just wasn't really interested in them. This is a big example here. So in his Analects, we have one of his disciples that ask him about the proper rituals to perform when honoring one's ancestors. And Confucius's response is, you are not yet able to serve people. How could you be able to serve ghosts and spirits? So when people would ask him about metaphysical questions about like how to best, in this case, offer rituals to one's ancestors, people will ask him questions about the nature of the divine, the nature of the gods, which God we should worship. Anytime he's presented with a question like this, Confucius brings the focus and the attention back down to what would worldly affairs, right? You're not yet able to serve people. How do you expect to serve ghosts? Right? The focus being, well, you need to focus on your ethical behavior before you even start to entertain these ideas of serving your ancestors or these ghosts. And this is further seen in when he was asked about his aspirations in life. He was asked what he hoped to accomplish in his life, and his answer was to bring comfort to the aged, to inspire trust in my friends, and to be cherished by the youth. Again, the appeal here is to human community, human society. The focus is on the human world rather than the metaphysical world. And the focus is on the ethical interaction of people rather than the person's relationship to God, right? So it's a very worldly focused rather than what we would call like a religious focus. Speaking of that traditionalism, Confucianism is often accused of being a conservative philosophy. Now, when I talk about conservatism, I'm referring to, again, we're talking about general political philosophy, not American politics. So in American politics, we associate the Conservative Party with the Republican Party. Conservatism in philosophy is an appeal to or a wanting to maintain traditional ideas, beliefs, and systems, right? So sometimes conservatism is called traditionalism, and Confucius is oftentimes accused of being a traditionalist. And that's kind of true He's a traditionalist in the sense that he's going to appeal to traditional works of literature, philosophy, art in his answers to these questions, but he's not going to settle for traditional practices. And so in that sense, we could call him a revivalistic traditionalist, or he's practicing revivalistic traditionalism. He's wanting to breathe new life into these traditions. So the idea here, so he says that there's no higher standard of judgment than human civilization at its best. So this gets back to that division between philosophy and religion. He's not appealing to some divine standard. He's a traditionalist in the sense that he says that the best examples that we have are human examples. And if we want to build a way forward, it's got to be from those human examples. And in this respect, Confucius says, I transmit rather than innovate. I trust in and love the ancient ways. So he's saying that we should uphold these traditional ideas and values, but that we should rediscover them in light of our present context. Now, the third point I want to talk about is the Confucian focus on the family. Confucianism emphasizes the family as not just, it's twofold here. The family is seen as kind of the microcosm of the larger world at play. And family relationships are going to be emphasized. So let's get back to that first question, that political question. How should you best structure a state? Confucius would say that you should structure the state in a similar way. There's an analogy here with how the state is structured and how the family is structured, that the core atomic family provides a structure that should be mimicked in the upper foundations of government. So there's two parts to this. The first is that, why is the family so important? Because it is with the family that we really first learn how to be a good person. It's within our familial context that we learn about and understand the ways in which the world is structured and about how we should act in the world. Our first lessons in virtue, our first lessons in morality comes from our mothers and our fathers. And in the same way, now Confucianism is very patriarchal, as were most ancient societies. So forgive the example here, but the idea was that in the same way as the father rules over the household, so the king should rule over the people. In the same respect that you give towards your father as the head and the lead of the family, you should be giving to your king as the head and the lead of the country. In the same way your father cares about you as his child, the king should care about his people as his children. So the family provides that core bedrock that we grew up with and that we further applied to the world. And then there's also this idea of differentiated caring, that our strongest moral obligations are found in our moral obligations to our community who raised us, the friendships that we developed in childhood, and especially our kinship, our parents, our family. Okay. So this kind of ties in with number 2, which was that traditionalism that I talked about. There's this concept in Confucianism called Li. And Li, in a traditional sense, refers to the kind of classic rituals / actions that a person was expected to perform. both within a religious context and both in what we would call etiquette, how you talk to and how you interact with other people. So, for example, if you lived in ancient China and you went to the local temple and maybe you wanted to offer up a prayer slash sacrifice to your grandparents, there was a specific way that you went about doing that and that you were expected, because ritual during this time was a public affair. It was not something that was done in private. It was something that was done in the public space of the temple. There's a certain way that you were expected to do that, a proper way of doing that. But Lee also referred to the rituals that are involved in interpersonal dynamics. Now, as Americans, this is not something that we really think about a lot, but we do have some examples of proper etiquette. So let's say you're at work and you're going to meet with a client, or you potentially meet a customer, right? You greet each other. What do? You reach out and shake their hand, right? That's proper etiquette. It would be weird if somebody reached out to shake your hand and you were just like, nah, right? That would be considered rude. It would be improper. It would be embarrassing for that person. So when we talk about Lee, that's what we're talking about. Religious rituals, yes, but also what we would call etiquette. And for Confucius, it's not enough to just do the ritual, that there also has to be this idea of humaneness behind the ritual. There has to be a purpose or a reason for you doing the ritual. And this is what a later Confucian scholar would say. I want to read this quote at length because it's a very important one. One performs the rain sacrifice and it rains. Why? I say, there is no special reason why. It is the same as when one does not perform the rain sacrifice and it rains anyway. When the sun and the moon suffer eclipse, one tries to save them. When heaven sends drought, one performs the rain sacrifice. One performs divination and only then decides on important affairs. This is not for the sake of getting what one seeks, but rather to giving things proper form. This is the crux of the quote and the concept here. You don't do these things for the sake of getting something out of them. You do them because of their cultural and ritualistic significance. Thus, the gentleman looks upon this as proper form, but the common looks upon it, sorry, that's a typo there, but the common looks on it as connecting with spirits. So the gentleman is not concerned about the metaphysical implications of the rain sacrifice. The gentleman does it because it's the proper thing to do. And this is an idea in anthropology that's called functionalism, that rituals provide a certain function in cultures that is practical, that you can separate from its metaphysical implications. Now, the last point, maybe the most important point here, is the emphasis on ethical cultivation. Now, in philosophy, Confucianism would be similar to a theory of ethics, which is today called virtue ethics. And we could talk about this a little bit later if y'all are curious. But you have these big, grand ethical theories, theories such as deontology, that actions are good in and of themselves, that murder is wrong because you shouldn't kill other people, right? You have utilitarian ethics. Utilitarianism is sometimes called consequentialism, that the goodness or badness of an action depends upon that action's consequence, whether you're acting for the greatest good, yada, yada, yada. Virtue ethics focuses on the overall cultivation of virtue within the person, and not so much on a singular action that the person commits. So when Confucius talks about ethical cultivation, he's talking about the development of virtue for the individual. Now, ethical cultivation, Confucius divides between learning and thinking. So learning is what it sounds like. You learn different ethical principles. Maybe you read different stories that are supposed to teach a moral lesson. You memorize the story. Thinking is actually sitting down and absorbing the consequences of those actions / virtues, right? Making it a vital part of your intellectual life. In thinking, I have two number ones here. I'm not sure why I did that. Thinking is really what we ought to be striving for. That it's not enough just to memorize these moral platitudes, but one has to know them in such an intimate way that we're able to carry it out on a daily basis. All right. Well, that's all I got for this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know, and I will see you all next time.